I'm Tom, coming to you from the International Institute for the Advancement of Sourdough Science and Research of Cleveland, Ohio, also known as my kitchen. Thank you for selecting this video. In today's video, we're going to talk about the biggest mistake people make with their sourdough starter. Now, I thought that I had seen every possible mistake people could make with their sourdough starter when I made a video a couple years ago called 50 Ways to Kill Your Starter. In that video, I experimented and chronicled all the ways that people accidentally think they kill their starter and actually proved that other than getting moldy, you really can't kill a starter. But I showed examples of where people would put their starter in the oven to keep it warm, and then a kid would come home from school and try to preheat the oven to make a pizza, and they would cook somebody's starter. You could recover that and save it. There were examples where people would start feeding their starter in the morning before they put their glasses on or before they had coffee, and they would feed it xanthan gum or some kind of gluten-free flour. You could recover from that. So I went through all these experiments. It's a fascinating video if you want to watch that. And I thought that I had really proven that there's really no way to kill your starter. But I've been proven wrong, and in the most peculiar way, because of all those other scenarios I looked at. Those were mistakes. They were unintentional. They were mishaps. They were accidents. But what I see now is people are actually killing their starter through some bizarre intentional method because they're uninformed on how to feed their starter. And they feed it in such a way that it weakens it so much they think it's dead and they throw it away. It's like some type of sourdough starter fratricide going on. We need to get to the bottom of this and stop people from killing their starters through their feeding methods. So to understand what's going on here, let's start with the basics of a daily sourdough feeding regimen. What people do is they keep their starter, they feed it once a day, and normally what you would do is discard 2/3 of the prior day's starter, and then you would feed the remaining starter equal parts flour and equal parts water. That's called a 1-1-1 feeding ratio, where the first one, is the retained amount of starter, call that 30 grams. The second one is the fresh flour that you're adding, call that 30 grams. And the last one of the 1-1-1 ratio is 30 grams of water. So it's retained starter, flour, water, 1-1-1, 30 grams of each that I'll use throughout this example. That's a typical starter feeding ratio. Now people ask, why do you have to discard? If you keep your starter on the countertop and you feed it daily, you have to discard because it goes through a cycle where your starter consumes all the flour, and then after all the flour is exhausted, it's basically swimming in its own waste. Your starter becomes very acidic and all the food from the prior day is gone, so you have to refeed it. But if you just piled more food on top of that, you're taking an increasing starter population and adding more flour to it, where within a week you'd be at a massively large amount of flour that you would need to feed it. So you need to discard a portion of it to knock that initial starter population down to a small number so it can grow back up to where it was the day before. So you're constantly knocking back that starter population and then giving it some runway to regrow. You knock it back again the next day, and then it regrows the next day. And that's the constant cycle of feeding your starter, so that then when you're ready for baking, you take a small portion of that and you bulk it up for the amount of starter or leaven that you need for your sourdough baking. So if you follow that typical method, that works perfectly fine for your starter. You feed it, you let it rise. After it peaks and starts falling, you discard and refeed it again. What happens with this biggest mistake that people make is they get impatient. They feed their starter, they watch it, they expect it to double in 4 hours, it doesn't double in 4 hours. They expect it to double in 8 hours, it doesn't double in 8 hours. Then they get impatient before the starter has risen and they discard and feed again. If you discard your starter and refeed it before it peaks, it weakens your starter. This is the biggest mistake people make. People make this mistake when they're trying to create a brand new starter. People make this mistake when they're maintaining an existing starter. People make the mistake when they put their starter in the refrigerator. They take it out and they expect it to come back to life in 4 hours. Anytime the starter is rising slower than expected, you're always at risk of this impatient problem where if you discard and feed before it peaks, it weakens your starter. Now let's talk about some basic starter math so you can understand what's going on when you feed your starter, and it will help you avoid this problem of prematurely discarding and weakening your starter. So let's assume I do a daily feeding 1-1-1 and I keep 90 grams of starter each day. Now let's also assume that if we had a microscope, we could count the number of yeast cells that are in this starter when it peaks. That's my peak population. And just to keep the math simple, let's assume there are also 90 yeast cells in this starter when it peaks. So I have 90 grams of starter, 90 yeast cells at peak. Now it's time for me to discard and refeed. When I do a 1-1-1 feeding, I discard 2/3, so I'm taking 60 grams of starter, but I'm also taking 60 cells of yeast and I'm disposing of them. They're not in here anymore. They're in the trash, they're in my compost, they're in a discard recipe the next day. So when I do that 2/3 discard, I'm reducing my starter population down to 30 cells of yeast. Then I feed it 30 grams of water, 30 grams of flour, so I get back to my 90 grams of starter, but now it's diluted because I only have 30 yeast cells swimming around in that 90 grams of starter. So just to get back to where it was before the feeding, my yeast population needs to triple in size. I start with 30 yeast cells. It needs to double the population just to get up to 60, which is less than where I need to be. Then it has to grow to another 30 yeast cells on top of that just to get back to where it was prior to the discard and refeeding. So it takes a huge amount of energy and time and food for your starter just to get back to where it was. If you discard at any time before it gets back to that previous population, that's what weakens your starter, because you're reducing the population of the carryover starter on the next feeding. If I discard any time before that starter reaches its old population, I'm weakening my starter. If you do that enough times in a row, you'll get your starter down to a handful of yeast cells. You think it's dead, and then you throw it in the garbage. But most people don't keep a microscope in their kitchen, so how do you know when your starter has gotten back to that previous level of the yeast population? We use a proxy to do that, and that's basically by looking at how the starter behaves after you feed it, how it rises, peaks, and falls. So now let's talk about the starter feeding cycle. So to avoid this issue of premature discarding, which weakens your starter, we need to figure out some way to read our starter to understand what's the point where you can tell that your starter is at least back to its prior population that it was at before you discard it. The way we do that is through the starter feeding cycle. Here's a chart. There are 7 stages in the starter feeding cycle. Let me walk you through these and I'll show you an example of what your starter should look like at each one of these stages. Stage 1, recently fed. This is right after you discard and refeed your starter. Your starter is going to be flat. There will be no bubbles. It'll smell like flour and water. There's basically no activity. That's your starting line, and a lot of people will put a rubber band around their jar at that starting line. That's important to know for tracking these 7 stages. The second stage is when your starter is rising. So here's an example where you see it now puffing up, rising up above that rubber band starting line, and it's domed up on the top. You may see a few bubbles or air holes on the top of your starter during stage 2, the rising stage. Stage 3 is when it's at peak. Now as your starter rises, you'll see it will be domed up on the top. It'll continue rising in the jar, and then it will stall out at a certain point, and that dome on the top will flatten. That's the peak of your starter. That's a very important thing to know, is when your starter is at peak. Then your starter moves past peak and it will begin falling. So the level of the starter drops below that peak level, and you'll see it dropping in the jar, and you'll typically see it become more liquefied and covered with bubbles as it starts falling. Stage 5 is where your starter has completely fallen back to the starting line, the original rubber band line. There's still a lot of bubble activity on top, but it's dropped back to that original marker. Stage 6 is when your starter is hungry. Now this is where it's at the starting line, but the bubble activity is starting to subside. So you see the number of bubbles reducing. And then stage 7 is where your starter is starving. This is where all the flour has been consumed. There's no bubble activity left in the jar, and you see this thin layer of alcohol forming on the top known as hooch. That's the indication that your starter has completely risen, fallen, exhausted its food source, and is starting to starve. So where does this problem of the premature discarding occur? It occurs when you discard and refeed your starter before it peaks. It's as simple as that. It's a simple rule. Never discard and refeed your starter before it peaks. That weakens your starter. So now you know the worst time to discard and feed your starter is before your starter peaks. A lot of people ask, what's the best time to discard and feed? It depends what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to strengthen a weak starter, you want to catch your starter just after peak and do something I call peak-to-peak feeding. I've covered this in a prior video, where you feed your starter normally, you watch it rise, and as soon as the starter, that dome on top of the starter flattens, you know that you're just past peak. That's when your starter is at its optimal population. So at that point, you want to discard and refeed, wait for it to peak again. As soon as the top flattens out, discard and refeed. If you do that about 3 times in a row, you can substantially increase the strength of your starter because you're catching that population at its peak. Then you're reseeding the starter with fresh water and flour. It grows even faster on the next cycle. You catch it at peak again. But you don't need to do that for daily feeding. I'll do that right before I'm ready to bake. I'll do 3 of those short succession peak-to-peak feedings. Or periodically, if you just feel like your starter is getting weak, you can do that peak-to-peak even 5 times over a couple of days to rebalance your starter population. Now, if you're just doing daily maintenance of your starter, this is what I do, is if I leave my starter on the countertop, you don't have to catch it at peak. This is what I call kind of sustenance feeding, which is you can let your starter rise and fall, and as long as it doesn't get to that starving stage where you see the hooch on top and all the bubbles are gone, your starter population is still very much alive in that starter. It's not at its optimal level because it's very acidic. It's kind of swimming in its own waste. But if you only bake once a week, you can do that for 5 or 6 days during the week, let your starter rise and fall, and then a day or 2 before you plan to bake, do that short succession peak-to-peak feeding to strengthen it for baking. Now that we know how to observe our starter and catch it at or after the peak for best results, I want to show you how that feeding works versus what happens when you discard and refeed your starter prior to it peaking, which always weakens your starter. So we start with 30 yeast cells in our recently fed starter. It starts growing and reproducing over time. And when that starter peaks in volume, now it's even stronger than the original starter we started with at 90 yeast cells. Now we have 105 yeast cells at peak, assuming we could count those. Now it's time to discard and refeed. This is using that peak-to-peak method. I discard 2/3 of 105, so I throw away 70 yeast cells, and now I have 35 yeast cells in my 30 grams of starter that's remaining, so I have a more highly concentrated carryover starter. I feed that 30 grams of water, 30 grams of flour. Now that peaks again, and now I have 120 yeast cells, so it's growing in population again. It's strengthening. I discard right after it peaks, so I discard 2/3 of that 120. Now I have 40 yeast cells in my 30 grams of starter. So I'm increasing the strength and concentration of my yeast population in my starter again. That starter peaks. Now I have 135 yeast cells in my starter at peak. I discard 2/3 of 135, which is 90 yeast cells, and I have 45 yeast cells remaining. So look what happened here. Just in those 4 feedings, I went from 30, 35, 40, 45. I've now increased my starter population in my seed starter, that 30 grams of starter, by 50%. I have 45 yeast cells when 3 feedings ago I had 30. This is how the peak-to-peak method works. You can do this to periodically strengthen your starter. Now let's look at an example of what happens when I discard and refeed my starter before it peaks. This is the big mistake. You don't want to make this because discarding and refeeding your starter before it peaks weakens your starter. So we start in the exact same place, 90 grams of starter with 90 yeast cells. I discard 2/3 of the starter and 2/3 of the yeast cells. I have 30 grams of starter and 30 yeast cells in my initial starting population. I add 30 grams of flour, 30 grams of water, but I don't wait for it to peak because I'm impatient. So it rises about halfway and I say, I'm going to discard and refeed my starter now before it peaks, but there are only 75 yeast cells in my starter because it hasn't peaked yet. So now I'm discarding 50 of the 75. I only have 25 yeast cells in my remaining 30 grams of starter. So I'm weakening my starter. Now I feed that 30 grams of flour, 30 grams of water. I get impatient again. It rises about halfway. Now it only gets up to 60 yeast cells and I get impatient and discard and refeed before it peaks. So I discard 40 yeast cells and now I only have 20 yeast cells in my 30 grams of starter. So I'm diluting my carryover starter. I'm shrinking my yeast population. I feed it again, 30 grams of flour, 30 grams of water. It rises about halfway. Now I only get 45 yeast cells because I'm always starting with a lower population. So it's working harder just to get back to where it was before. Now I discard 30 of the 45. I have only 15 yeast cells left in my 30 grams of starter. I've significantly weakened my starter with that premature discarding before it peaks. This is the fatal flaw. If you do this enough times, your starter will become so weak that you'll think it's dead. I see people do this all the time. And I ask them, why did you do this? Why were you feeding it before it peaked? And they said, somebody told me it should peak in 4 hours. So if it didn't peak, I thought I should discard and refeed. Or somebody told me I should be discarding and feeding twice a day, regardless of what my starter is doing. So I discarded and fed every 12 hours. And all you're doing is weakening your starter by doing that. So now let's compare the two examples together. By discarding and refeeding my starter after it peaks, I grew my starter population by 50%. And from that exact same starting point, just by discarding and feeding based on a different timing, because I was impatient, I discarded and fed before it peaked, I reduced my starter population by 50%. That's a massive difference in starter strength. Now, as you can see from these charts, I've simplified the charts and I've simplified the math just for this illustrative example. And some people might be saying, these charts are really pretty, but is there any science behind this? Let me just say there is. Yeah, I know there is because I built a starter lab in my basement a few months ago, and I ran almost 100 tests using an incredibly sophisticated setup to measure the starter strength at different times, temperatures, feeding ratios, hydration, different types of flour. I'm going to publish an entire separate video on the results of those experiments, but let me just say, I'm very confident in the science behind what I'm presenting here today. So you might ask yourself the question, I mean, this all looks so simple when you lay it out on paper and do the math and do the graphs. Why in the world do people do this? It's because it's very difficult to read your starter if you're not familiar with this. I'm assuming that I can count the number of yeast cells with a microscope. You can't count the number of yeast cells in your starter. You just look at your starter. So you really have to get good at reading your starter. And then on top of that, there's just a lot of guidance out there that is contradictory. People will say a strong starter should rise in 4 hours. That's true, it should. But if your starter doesn't rise in 4 hours, that doesn't mean you should discard and refeed it. Some people will say if your starter isn't rising and falling in 24 hours, you should start feeding it every 12 hours. That doesn't make any sense. If your starter hasn't peaked before 12 hours, it doesn't make any sense to discard and refeed it. But a lot of people will say that. People get confused by feeding ratios, where I've kept this simple with a 1-1-1 feeding ratio, where we discard 2/3 and then feed equal parts. Some people will say, if your starter is weak, go up to a 1-2-2 feeding ratio. What a 1-2-2 feeding ratio does is it discards 80% of what you started with and then adds 2 times the flour and 2 times the water. So your seed starter is even weaker. It's smaller and more diluted than the 1-1-1 feeding. And somehow people think 1-2-2 sounds bigger than 1-1-1, so it's got to help. So they'll do a 1-2-2 feeding. All that does is reduce and dilute your starter even more. And one other very common mistake is people misreading the hooch. That was the 7th step of the starter feeding cycle, where you've consumed all of your flour, all the bubbles have subsided, and you get that thin layer of alcohol on top known as hooch. Sometimes when people have a very weak starter, or when you're creating a brand new starter for the first time, if your starter is very weak, you'll actually get water separation before your starter even rises, and that water separation can look like hooch. So then people say, my starter is covered with hooch, what should I do? They're mistaken, it's actually water. But somebody online or somebody in a social media group might say, oh my gosh, if it's hoochy, it's starving, thinking it's at stage 7. It's not starchy, it's not starving, it's not hoochy. It's so weak that the water separated from the flour. So that people that confuse water separation with hooch is a huge problem out there, but there's an easy way to know the difference between the two, even though they look the same. Your starter can only be covered with hooch after it's vigorously risen and fallen and all the bubbles have subsided and the activity goes to 0. That's when the hooch occurs, never before that. So if you feed your starter, it never rises, it never bubbles, and it just separates and you see a thin layer on top, that can't be hooch. It's impossible, because hooch only occurs after it's vigorously risen and fallen and consumed all the flour. So if your starter is covered with a thin liquid, it could be one of those two things, but it's very, very simple to know which is which, because hooch can only occur at the end of the process. Water separation happens at the beginning. If it's water separation, don't discard and refeed, because that creates a weak starter. Stir it up, give it time. Always give it more time. And speaking of time, the question is, what happens if somebody feeds their starter and they've waited 24 hours and nothing happens? That's a long time. What should they do? You only have 2 options. Discard and refeed, which you never want to do before it peaks because it makes your starter weaker, or give it more time. Just give it more time. That's all you can do. There are yeast cells in there. I guarantee it. If you fed your starter with any pre-existing starter that you know is alive, there are yeast cells in it. And yeast cells, when they start eating and start reproducing, they give off bubbles. They'll tell you when they're active, and they'll tell you when they've run out of food, because the bubbles go away. Sometimes it takes a long time, but never discard before it peaks in volume or peaks in bubble activity, because it makes it weaker. Just give it more time. And lastly, people still get impatient and they say, yeah, but I want it to go faster. You can always warm up your starter, because it's also temperature sensitive. Some people's starter is incredibly sluggish because their kitchens are freezing in the winter. Your starter is more sensitive to temperature than anything. So a cool starter will take a long time to peak. A warm starter will take a short time to peak, but it could be the exact same starter. It could have the exact same yeast population, and one of them will rise slowly if it's cool. The same starter will rise quickly if it's warm. So rising quickly in and of itself doesn't mean it's strong, and rising slowly in and of itself doesn't mean it's weak, because it depends on the temperature. But you never want to heat up your starter so much that the temperature gets above 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius, because that can really ruin your starter. So this is the last example I'll share with you. Your sourdough starter is just like a house plant. You should treat it just like you would a plant. Now let me give you an example. I bought this plant about a week ago. this looks pretty rough. I bought it from a guy called the Plant Guy. He guaranteed that this would grow. I want it to grow more. I want it to look better. I want it to be stronger, just like my sourdough starter. So I'm going to call the Plant Guy and ask him how to fix this.
Plant Guy.
Hi, I bought a plant from you about a week ago.
Yeah.
And it's really not looking good. I've been feeding and watering it, and it just looks horrible. What can I do to fix that?
This is easy. Listen up. Once a day, every 24 hours, you got to prune back 2/3 of whatever you see there. Throw it away. Just discard it. Then you're going to feed it 200 grams of plant food, 200 grams of water. You got to do it every day, every 24 hours. So if you do it at 8 o'clock today, don't do it at 9 o'clock tomorrow. You got to be on time. Don't skip a day. Don't be late. Every 24 hours, no matter what. Prune it, feed it, water it. That's how you fix it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. So to make this plant grow faster, I need to cut off 2/3 of what's here and then feed it 200 grams of water and 200 grams of my plant food. Here we go. 2/3 coming off. So just like the guy said, I've pruned and I'm discarding 2/3 of my plant. And now I'm going to feed this 200 grams or 200 milliliters of water. That's a lot of water. And I'm going to feed it 200 grams of plant food, just like the guy recommended. There we go. Now I'll come back in 24 hours and we'll see what this looks like. Okay, it's been 24 hours. Nothing has happened. There's no new growth on this. I still have a pile of plant food sitting on top of it. It's still wet from the last feeding. And the guy said I should do this every 24 hours. So what he's saying now is cut off and prune another 2/3 of what's here. I mean, that'll be down to a nub. I should add more plant food when I have a pile of plant food sitting on top. And I should add more water when I can feel there's still water in here. So I'm not sure that I should take this guy's advice. This just feels odd to me. But I do know through my work here at the Institute, a professor over at the college who's a plant expert. I'm going to call him and get a second opinion.
Plant expert.
Yeah, hi. I bought a plant from a plant store, and I was trying to strengthen it and get it to grow, and they told me to prune it back and feed it and water it every morning, every 24 hours.
You've been talking to my cousin Mario, the plant guy? Yeah, let me tell you, he doesn't know jack about plants. You want that thing to grow, you want it to strengthen, you gotta cut it back 80%. You gotta feed it twice as much food and twice as much water as he's telling you, and you gotta do it twice a day. Every 12 hours.
But it's not growing at all.
I don't care about your butts. Listen, I'm a plant expert. I'm telling you, I know how this works. Twice a day pruning, twice a day feeding, twice a day watering, every 12 hours. It doesn't matter.
That doesn't make any sense. So the answer is obvious. If the plant hasn't shown any growth, it hasn't consumed any of the plant food, and it's still wet from the last watering, you don't do anything to it. You just give it time. I mean, this is so obvious if this were a house plant, but for some reason, if this were a sourdough starter, people would have discarded 80% of this and fed this twice a day today. They would have done exactly the wrong thing that you know is unequivocally wrong with a house plant. They do that with their sourdough starter. Your sourdough starter is just like a plant. The bubbles are the leaves. If you don't see any bubbles, it's not growing. So you wait. You don't give it more food. You don't give it more water. You just wait. It's crazy. I don't know why people do it, but for some reason, this is so apparent and so obvious that you would not prune, discard, feed, and water something like this. People do it with their starter all the time. Don't do that. So here's our final exam. You fed your starter 4 hours ago. Here's what it looks like. No activity, no bubbles. Some guy said your starter should rise in 4 hours. It's not rising. Should you discard and refeed? No, don't do it. Now it's 12 hours later. Let's see what the starter looks like. It looks like this. No activity, no bubbles. Should you discard and refeed? No, don't do it. Never. Never discard and refeed a weak starter before it bubbles. It makes it weaker. So now you wait 24 hours. Here's what your starter looks like. No activity, no bubbles, no rising. Now you're starting to say, I'm not so sure about this Tom guy. I'm going to get a second opinion. So you go out on social media, you join some sourdough group on Facebook, and you ask some people, what should I do with my sourdough starter? I fed it 24 hours and it hasn't risen. And they say, discard and refeed. Discard and feed twice a day, every 12 hours. Feed 122, feed 155. That's how you strengthen a weak starter. What do? Do you discard and refeed? No. Give it more time. Never discard and refeed a weak starter before it peaks in activity or volume. So what should you do if your starter just isn't active, if it isn't rising? Just give it time. Nothing bad can happen to your starter by letting it sit in a pool of flour and water. It can't starve to death. Nothing else bad can happen to it. The only thing bad that can happen to it is if you discard and refeed, because then you're diluting it. If you just let it sit, it will eventually wake up, it'll eventually start eating, it'll eventually start reproducing. When it does, it'll show you what it's doing because it'll start bubbling and it'll start rising. And in the unlikely event that it consumes all of its food, you'll see all the telltale signs before that. It'll bubble, it'll rise, it'll peak, it'll start falling, the bubbles will subside, the bubbles will disappear, and it will be covered with hooch. That's an unmistakable pattern that it will follow, so there's no way that it will accidentally starve to death before you see it go through that cycle. And in reality, even if your starter runs out of food, it doesn't actually starve to death, it just goes dormant. You can leave a starter unfed for a really long period of time, and it'll always bounce back. So when you think about what are the bad things that can happen to your starter, they all happen before the starter peaks, and they happen because you're doing it to your starter. Nothing else bad happens to your starter for a really long time. That's the lesson of the day. Thanks for sticking with me, and good luck on your sourdough journey.